Hello, everybody. Hope you guys are doing well. We're going to continue talking about ecology, and today's video is going to focus mainly on food webs and food chains. We're really only going to briefly discuss what a food web is. We're going to look at more of those later, but today we're going to focus on how to construct a food chain and what a food chain looks like and what the parts of a food chain are. So we have a couple of slides where I show you mostly examples, but a food chain is really something that you have to just learn how to draw based on organisms that you're given. So you're usually given a list of organisms, you have to put them in order, and you have to explain what's happening within that food chain. So let's do a quick example here where I'll just write out everything, and then I'll show you some pre-made examples. So if you're given a list of organisms and you're given something like a flower, a cricket, a a spider. Let's talk about maybe a bird and a snake. Okay, so you're given these 5 animals, and you need to figure out how to create a food chain for these particular animals. And once you create that food chain, you then have to fill in some additional information and then explain what's happening within that chain. So we learned about producers, we learned about consumers, we learned about decomposers. So whenever you're given a list like this, your first thing to do is really to just determine what each of these organisms fall under, right? And let's add actually one more thing, right? So what do each of these fall under? So we have flowers. Well, we know flowers are going to fall under our producer, right? Because flowers photosynthesize, they are a type of plant, and all types of plants are producers. We then have a cricket, which is going to be a consumer. We have a spider, which is also a consumer. A bird and a snake, all consumers. And why? Because consumers eat other organisms, whether they be plant or animal. So those all eat other things. And then we have worms, which we also know are decomposers. Okay. Now, since we labeled that, we also have to classify them. And as we learned, you're going to classify your organisms based on the order that they appear within a food chain. So we can't quite do that yet because we didn't make the food chain. Okay. So now that we have this, I'm going to give you some rules about food chains. Okay. So the rule about food chains is that your producer will always come first in a food chain, okay? It'll always come first. The producer always comes first. So in this case, our producer is flower. So we're going to write flower. And then we're going to write an arrow, just like that. What comes after the flower here? So the next thing to do is you got to use a little bit of analyzation. You have to use a little bit of pre-existing knowledge, and you have to use a little bit of just your basic understanding of how animals function. So which of these organisms here would most likely eat a flower? Do you think snakes are slithering around eating flowers? How about birds? Do they swoop down, eat flowers, and then fly back up? Spiders, do they really do that? How about crickets, right? So crickets are herbivores, and they will eat flowers. So they come right after the flower. Cricket. Now, before we fill in the rest of these, right, I want to explain what we have here so far. We have our producer, okay, and we have our consumer. Notice the way that the arrow is going. It is going toward the cricket. Why is it going toward the cricket? It's going toward the cricket because the energy in the flower is going to the cricket. The energy in the flower is going to the cricket. Okay? So when you're creating a food chain, your arrow will always point in the direction that the energy is going. I'm going to write that. Your arrow will always point in the direction the energy is going. Okay, so that is number one that you need to remember. This is number two. I will tell you right now, this is one of the biggest things that students get wrong, is that they put the arrow in the wrong way, right? They will flip the arrow and they'll point toward the flower instead of pointing toward the cricket. I'm telling you that that is wrong. You will get the question wrong entirely, okay? The energy always goes toward the organism that is eating. So in this case, the cricket is eating the flower, gaining the energy from the flower, right? So that energy goes to the cricket. So the arrow points toward the organism that is getting the energy. All right, what's next? So next we have a spider. The spider eats the cricket. So which way does that arrow go? That arrow will also go this way because the energy from the cricket is going to the spider when the spider eats it. That's also a consumer. Next, we have, excuse me, guys. Next, we have a bird. The bird will eat the spider. So the arrow points toward the bird because the energy from the spider goes to the bird when the bird eats it. That's also a consumer. And finally, we have snake. And the snake gets energy from the bird. The energy from the bird goes to the snake. When the snake eats it, the arrow is now pointed that way. And that is also a consumer. So now that we have our producers and consumers, we need to classify them. So that comes back to our tertiary, our quaternary, our primary, our secondary. So what do we always remember? Our primary consumer is the first consumer in the food chain. Which of these is the first consumer in our food chain? It's going to be your cricket, right? Because that eats the producer. So this is going to be your primary consumer. Your spider is your secondary. Your bird is your tertiary. And your snake is your quaternary. Okay? This is your food chain. This is how you have to write it. Now, you can, of course, write things a little differently. You don't have to write C1 for primary consumer. You can write the word primary consumer if you want, right? You can denote it however you want as long as it is clear to the person grading it that it is primary consumer. I recommend either doing it this way or actually writing out the phrase primary consumer. Okay? So what's missing? What about our worms, our decomposers? So what did we learn about decomposers? We learned that decomposers are able to gain energy from all different types of organisms in the food chain, all of them. So you're going to write your worms here, right? And you're going to have arrows that go to it from each organism. Because again, worms can gain energy from all different organisms in the food chain. All of these things here, flowers, crickets, spiders, birds, snakes, they all die. And when they die, they are decomposed by worms or bacteria or other things. Okay? And this is a food chain. So understanding how to write this food chain here, you can now apply this knowledge and do it with any sort of food chain. Right? So any list of organisms that you're given, you are able to now do that. You can also analyze a food chain that you are given already, and then you can fill in some missing info. So let's take a look at a couple of those. All right? Here's an example, right? Which is very similar to the one that we just did. You have leaves, which are going to be your producer. You have caterpillar, which is your primary consumer. You have snakes, which in this case are your secondary consumer, and your owl is your tertiary consumer. And in this food chain, there are only 3. It doesn't have to be 4, right? Food chains can vary in size. And again, like you see here, you have decomposers that gain energy from all of them, okay? Don't worry about what this line means for now, all right? Let's take a look at another one. Food chain. Now, in this food chain, we see the sun up here. And why is the sun up here, right? And we're going to learn this in a little bit, but I want you to at least have the knowledge for it now. All energy originates from the sun. This is extremely important, and again, we'll talk about it, but now that you've heard it, it'll at least be in your head. All energy originates from the sun, no matter who you're talking about, even us as humans. Our energy originates from the sun, right? Because the sun gives energy to plants, and every single thing we eat has eaten plants, right? Whether it be, we have a burger, that meat came from a cow. That cow ate grass. That grass got its energy from the sun. We could also just straight up eat veggies, right? Everything that we get, everything that we have originated from the sun. So it's important to remember that. Here you have your producer, your primary, secondary, and tertiary consumer. And again, your decomposer is getting energy from all of the possible organisms in this food chain. All right. Now, what about a food web? Well, a food web is only slightly different than a food chain. A food web is a system of connecting food chains, a system of connecting food chains. A food web is more complex than a food chain, and a food web is basically multiple food chains intertwined. So a food web are multiple chains that can, intersect, and they can go through each other. We're going to see an example of that on the next slide. Okay, we're going to see an example of that on the next slide. All right. So we're obviously not doing a turn and talk, but let's just think about this question. It says, what species eats more than one organism? Okay, so look at this food web. And what species eats more than one organism? Well, there are plenty of options. You could say python, right? Python has 3 arrows pointing toward it, right? It has arrow number 1, arrow number 2, arrow number 3. And what that means is that it gets its energy from 3 different sources. It gets its energy from the rat. It could eat frogs. And yes, pythons can even destroy and kill and eat wolves, right? Which you don't think is possible, but you have not met a python. Those guys are super dangerous, right? Really strong, super dangerous. So 3, you could also have said a butterfly, right? Butterfly has 2 arrows. It gets its energy from either a flowering plant or lavender, right? So this is an example of a food web. There are many, many food chains found in this picture. Many of them, okay? There are many food chains. Let's actually look at one. So I'm going to erase everything that I did here so that it's a little more clear. And basically, when you look at a food chain, one of the things that you should try and do is determine where the food webs are, right? When you look at a food web, you should determine where the food chains are. So let's just start always. Where do we always start? What did we just say? We always start at the producer level. So our producer level is way at the bottom here. Corn, flowering plant, lavender, and mangoes. So let's take a look and let's just start off at mangoes. So one food chain that we have that originates from mangoes is mangoes to the fruit fly, to the dragonfly, to the thrush, to the eagle. You could have also have another one that starts at the mangoes. It goes mango, fruit fly, straight to the thrush, and then to the wolf, and then to the python, right? That is another food chain. If you want to talk about a completely different one that also originates from mangoes, you can go mangoes, fruit fly, straight to the frog, and then to the python, okay? Or you can break off and go from frog to the eagle, okay? So do you see how a food chain has so many different things, there's so many components to it, and a food web even more so, because there are so many chains within that web. So a very typical question that you might see on a test is to analyze this food web, where it'll ask you to pick out a specific food chain from the web and describe it and classify it, just like we did. It might ask you to pick, a specific animal and talk about what that animal eats. It might tell you to determine energy flow from one organism to the next. It might tell you, it might give you an example of one organism, and it'll say something like, where does the rat get its energy from in this food web? Well, find the rat. Where does it get its energy from? Only from the grasshopper. So that's where it gets its energy from. So there's so many different things you can do with this. You got to analyze it and understand it, okay? So we're actually going to stop here, I believe. Yes. So we're going to stop here, and we're going to talk a little bit more about food webs in class tomorrow. Again, please make sure that you are clear on this. If you have any questions, reach out. Have a great rest of your day, everybody, and we will see you